What is up, everybody? Welcome to another edition of the Saturday morning college football show here on RotoGrinders. Excited to be with you, breaking down another week of college football action. We've got a really interesting main slate today. I think could be one of the higher scoring slates, particularly on DraftKings, that we have seen so far this year. So happy to be back with you. I am Justin Van Zuden, aka STL Cardinals 84. Back after a week off. We went down to St. Louis last weekend, watched the Cardinals lose in the playoffs, and then came home. It was a glorious time, at least for the Philly fans anyway. Moving on and still alive against the Braves, so we'll see if they can keep that rolling. But we're here to talk college football, and to do that, I've got my usual co-host, Micah Bedard, alongside me. Micah, what's going on this morning?
Doing good, Justin. Glad to have you back. This is definitely a slate where, from a game total perspective, you got 5 or 6 games really that you can really stack in the afternoon. We do have some news like starting early that we'll get to that you didn't think you had to deal with last week. Donovan Smith all of a sudden just didn't play quarterback, and a 4.5 quarterback backup was the play. And then I had a good week. I think once you get in October, you're kind of getting these snap counts and targets, and you can really condense down your player pool. So excited to get after it this week.
Yeah, it was interesting last week. I think I picked a good week to kind of take a break and recharge and get ready to go for this week with all the shenanigans, the Donovan Smith news. They didn't announce it for competitive reasons or whatever they said. Of course you didn't. That's kind of why you wouldn't. But we'll see if any of that comes to fruition this week. As far as injury news, it sounds like Bryce Young is expected to play this afternoon. Alabama obviously will certainly need him more than they did last week, and they survived a scare in last week's game. Dylan Gabriel, questionable after suffering a concussion, full go in practice, so it sounds like he's going to go. And look, I was out last week. I looked at the box score. I saw that Oklahoma used like all sorts of gimmicky quarterbacks. I need the 30-second rundown on what the heck happened with Oklahoma last week.
I'll be honest, I didn't watch that much of that game because it was just, they had Jaleel Farouk running the Wildcat. You look at snap counts, like Bevel was in there all the time. He's just awful. It's kind of embarrassing that Oklahoma had a week to plan. They probably knew Gabriel wasn't going to play, and it was just that much of a, nightmare. Braden Willis was taking Wildcat snaps. It was embarrassing. Like, as an Oklahoma fan, I have a few friends that are, but they were trying a bunch of things. None of them worked. And they just got embarrassed last week.
49-0. That was not on the Family Feud board of potential final scores in that game, but a rough go to start the year for Oklahoma. They face the upstart Kansas team today, who will be on their backup quarterback as well. Daniels is out, potentially out for the season. And Bean did a nice job last week in relief, but they couldn't quite pull out a victory over TCU. So a lot of the news that we're looking at today kind of resides with those top end quarterbacks. Is there anything else that you are monitoring closely here today?
One of the keys to the slate we'll get to once we break down the receivers is BYU, I think. Arkansas has just been a funnel for pass offenses. Mississippi State obviously ran it up on them next week. But you got a lot of question marks in that wide receiver room. So that's one in the afternoon you'll kind of have to keep an eye on. There's a bunch of rumors about Spencer Sanders maybe not playing, but that is a shoulder issue. So that's one thing to watch up until lock. Last week it was a big scramble. And if you weren't by your computer, it was very tough to, edit all your lineups and get the Texas Tech backup quarterback in. But I think Sanders is really all you're else looking for. But in the early slates, nothing really big.
Yeah, not a whole lot, at least that we know of. If anything comes across, we do have a lot of 12 o'clock kickoffs. We'll pass that along. And if you're a premium subscriber, you can check that out in the RotoGrinders Discord, rotogrinders.com/Discord. Of course, we offer you this show every week for free on YouTube. And if you enjoy the content, drop a thumbs up on the video. We appreciate that very much. Helps out the channel. And subscribe. You can check out all of our live videos when we go live here at RotoGrinders. With that, let's go ahead and start digging into this Saturday slate. So I mentioned, I think it could be a high scoring one. Our DraftKings slate this week has the usual 13-ish games, some high totals out there. We've got a MAC game on the slate. That always helps lead to higher scoring, and a few underpriced players that we will get to throughout the analysis here. But Always interesting to see how they're going to make up these slates, and having Ohio and Western Michigan on there is going to make a difference, at least if you're playing on DraftKings today, in how the chalkier builds will come across. But let's start with the high-end quarterbacks, and we have question marks. I mean, Bryce Young seems like he's going to be a full go. That's probably the marquee game of the day in a game that could be a shootout against Tennessee. Gabriel coming back from injury. Jaron Hall's been up and down throughout the year. I mean, do we need to prioritize spending top dollar on a quarterback today? I think most would lean towards no.
Yeah, Gabriel is risky. I think that Oklahoma comes out in this one. Like, it's definitely not the offense that has let them down. Gabriel gets hurt against TCU, and then last week was just a disaster. Like, I don't mind spending up on him. I think he probably comes in more around 5% owned. I won't have Young and Gabriel in the same lineup, but Young, if Young is, he's got an AC joint sprain, I think, everyone, I looked last night at Bryce Young. There are like Tennessee fans like diagnosing his injury who clearly are not doctors about like how,
everyone's a doctor
about how they can take him out of the game. So, but if Bryce Young plays and is at 100%, which I think he's going to play, I don't think he is at 100% or he's going to get the full run. I mean, Tennessee's defense, I mean, the secondary is something to take advantage of. So Young is definitely a high ceiling, very risky play that I don't think a lot are going to go up to. And I like him for GPPs. I don't think he's going to make my main lineup or anything, but we've seen what he can do. Like CJ Stroud last week, right? Against a bad Michigan State secondary, just took off against them. So I like Young. Jaron Hall, I think, is the best GPP quarterback of the slate. I mentioned Arkansas at the beginning. Hall has not had a great season so far, but he does have the wheels to do stuff with his legs, and Arkansas is just letting anybody who wants to pass on them. So I think Hall is a really good GPP play because he's right there next to, we'll get to Max Duggan and Spencer Sanders. I like Hall, and, I'll have all three of those guys from Hall, Gabriel, and Young in my GPP pool as of right now.
Yeah, I mean, all probably looking at 7 to 15% ownership, as you can see with our projections. So certainly upside there in the GPP range. Most people are probably going to look to go a little bit cheaper, and that would probably be starting in that next range of quarterbacks, which would be Duggan. Sanders, who is certainly rising in popularity, and I believe might be our highest overall, price not a factor, fantasy point, highest projected quarterback of the day. You've got Hendon Hooker in that, again, huge game against Alabama. Bean, who I mentioned, came in and did well last week against that Oklahoma team that's in shambles right now. You got Tagovailoa if you want to go just below the 7K range at 6,900 against an Indiana team that is running a ton of plays this year. So that game could be a potential shootout. And this is probably where most people are going to go, for their first quarterback selection today. How do you kind of parse out that upper mid tier?
Yeah, Duggan has just been ridiculous so far this year. I think he's got 37 and 51 fantasy points in his last couple games. So I definitely like him here. Oklahoma State is, once again, let a backup quarterback do whatever they want against them last week, threw for almost 400 yards. So I definitely think that Duggan's a great play. Spencer Sanders, I faded him at 30% last week. He didn't kill me. I think this week, we'll just have to see what he kind of does if he is limited by his shoulder or anything like that. But I definitely think that Sanders, I might be a little bit underweight on, but he's definitely in a great spot, and he's taken away a lot of that running upside from Dominic Richardson, Jason Bean, the rest of those guys between Bean and Clifford, I don't think I'll have any of. I actually think Oklahoma comes out and makes a statement in this game. So I'm probably off of a lot of the Kansas guys. And yeah, Baby Tua for Maryland's in a great spot. I mean, he's got, Indiana, as you mentioned, runs a ton of snaps. They have a bad pass defense. So you really couldn't draw up a better script for him. So I like Baby Tua. He's going to be one of my highest owned quarterbacks. You see, he projects well. I don't think he's going to be that chalky because some other guys will get to, but I definitely like him. He's in this range. He's probably my favorite quarterback.
Well, you mentioned Oklahoma making a statement. Does that mean they only lose by 30 this week, or maybe only lose by 21? Keep it somewhat competitive. I was impressed. I mean, again, I was out last week, but we were doing some stuff on Saturday afternoon, and the place we were at had that Kansas game on the TV, and I was impressed with their offense being able to keep up. Certainly, Bean doesn't have the athleticism of Daniels, but I'm not playing him today either. But was impressed with them at least being able to hang offensively last week. We've talked about Tagovailoa. It seems like Maryland's been on the main slate every week. And Maryland's offense has been a bit disappointing at times, but given the matchup today and the fact, again, I think Indiana's running like 87 offensive plays per game, something like that. I think that that Maryland offense is interesting today, and we're getting reasonable ownership on him at about 15-16%. But if we go lower in that 7K range, this is where the chalk QB2s are going to lie. It's going to be Jefferson for a lot of people, and it's going to be Rourke for a lot of people. Ohio's defense is miserable. They gave up like 750 yards of offense to Fordham. And, almost all of their games have gone flying over the total. They're playing Western Michigan today. I think the total's in around 60. And Rourke, who's no slouch for a MAC quarterback, is 6,200 on DraftKings. So Jefferson, Rourke, do you have a preference between the two?
Yeah, you mentioned at the beginning, it's like DraftKings was like, okay, we had a pretty solid 12-game slate. Let's go ahead and throw Ohio and Western Michigan on the slate. But at least it's a good fantasy game, But it's weird because they usually don't do this every week. They'll just put a Big Ten game on. So I'm fine with them putting this one. And Curtis Rourke's in a great spot. You see that projection. You see that ownership. I think I'm just going to eat the chalk with him. Western Michigan is bad. Ohio's defense is pretty bad. But the problem is Western Michigan's offense is just terrible. So Salopek early in the week, PSU and I were talking about him, but I'm off of him. I think KJ, coming back, it's not like, he had a head injury essentially, I think, for the most part. So it's not really like you're worried about him being banged up. And once again, he doesn't throw it that much, but against this BYU defense, he's if you want to pay down at quarterback, you can play KJ and Rourke and really build whatever lineup you have with some of the other value pieces. So I like him. Really, those are the only two guys in this range that I'm really concerned with. Like I said, there's a lot of guys from like maybe 2 up that I have in my pool. But as of right now, like in the 6Ks, this lower range, I really just have KJ and Rourke. But they're both in good spots. And they're both really good plays.
Yeah, there's not a lot of other, kind of sneaky choices down here. I suppose the other viable options that a lot of people would consider would maybe be Schrader, maybe Ashford again, and Tyler Van Dyke for Miami because he's 5K on DraftKings. And that does maybe help you get another option. I suppose Jackson Dart, maybe a guy I didn't mention, but I don't love a lot of these guys. Is there anybody that you think if you had to pick a dart throw, you would feel better about than others in GPPs?
Yeah. Quinn Ewers, at 5,700, I think he's a dart throw. He's in a bad spot. But you saw that Texas offense last week. Back with Ewers, he's a really good player. And if he's going to be 5% owned, I feel a lot better than him than, Tyler Van Dyke at double his ownership. So Ewers and Worthy, I think, are a really good stack because last week Sanders and Bijan really got a lot of the work. Worthy didn't get in the end zone. So I'll go right back to him here. And I think Ewers is in a good spot. And I think he's too cheap at 5.7K, even against Iowa State when they're still projected to, win that game pretty handily. Tyler Van Dyke threw for 500 yards last week against North Carolina. I think a lot of these Miami guys, it's really tough because they're in a good, they were in a really good spot last week. They put up great numbers. So if a lot of box score watchers are looking, they're like, okay, Mallory caught 100 yards last week. Tyler Van Dyke threw for 500. Henry Parrish did really well. But, that was against, one of the best defenses to target offensive players against in UNC. So Van Dyke, I'll have some of him. He's probably still too cheap to be 5K. Remember, beginning of the season, this was a guy that people were talking about as a dark horse Heisman candidate. So at 5K, he's worth a punt. But I'd probably rather go up to Ewers actually in GPP.
I think the dark horse Heisman candidate ship has sailed at this point. It's capsized. It's probably out. But at 5K, it's worth a look. I don't necessarily think you need it. The $1,200 more to get Rourke, who we've got projected like 6 points higher, I think makes the most sense. Any other quarterbacks that maybe I didn't bring up that we've missed, or anything else you want to pass along at the position?
Now my pool's pretty small this week. As I mentioned at the beginning, you can really narrow down really who you want to play, and so I think we covered basically everyone here. I'll just recap. I think Hall's probably my favorite GPP play, and if he's going to be at that I think what 8% owned. I mean, I'm going to have 20% plus of him in that matchup. I think that game, BYU Arkansas and Indiana Maryland, are kind of getting overlooked a little bit. Like everybody's going to play Oklahoma State TCU, but I think there are games with just pretty similar totals that are going to be a lot lower owned that I really like as GPP targets.
All right, let's go ahead and move on to the running back position. Again, we've got Bijan Robinson, Ibrahim, Braylon Allen, Jahmyr Gibbs, and Blake Corum, the same guys that we've been seeing every week on these main slates near the top of the pricing scales. A lot of Big Ten teams. Texas is another one that's been on the main slate almost every week. How are we breaking down kind of the top trio, or maybe throw Gibbs in there as well? Gibbs and Corum, say those top 5 running backs today.
Yeah, who's ready to get burned by Mo Ibrahim again, right? After he just sat mysteriously against, who was that, against Purdue. So he's back here, but man, that total is so low. I'd rather, play Chase Brown if I had to play a running back in that matchup. Like Ibrahim needs to just destroy, and I think Illinois actually wins that game outright. So Bijan, he's Bijan. What can you say? He's gonna run for 100 yards. He's probably going to catch a couple passes. But the question is, does he get in the end zone 3 or 4 times? Because that's really what you need for him to kill you. So I think he's fine from a floor play. He definitely has a good ceiling, but it's just a question of like how much you're going to pay up in salary to get up to him. So I'll definitely have some shares, but especially with the rest of this offense looking pretty good, it's definitely not Bijan or bust. I mean, Bijan could get no touchdowns here and still rack up 100 yards, and then you're just kind of dead in the water with him. So I still like him. Braylon Allen, I'll continue to go back to him, man. I mean, last week, Graham Mertz sets the world on fire and gets like every red zone touchdown, and Allen didn't get anything. And so I like him against Michigan State. I think he's a really good GPP play, and he'll probably will be owned, but he is back after gaining 2 yards a couple weeks ago. And so he'll be back and ready for this one. Jahmyr Gibbs also, I like him a little less now that Bryce Young is in. You've seen him be featured when Bryce Young is really playing. But on the other end of that, if they do struggle and Bryce Young gets knocked out of this game, Gibbs is going to get all the work that he can. So I like all those top 4, except for Ibrahim. I think Allen and Gibbs are probably going to be the main guys I have in my lineups of that top tier.
Yeah, the Big Ten is so lopsided in terms of their divisions. They've got Michigan, Ohio State, and Penn State all in the east side of the Big Ten, and then Illinois controlling their destiny now on the west side and in the top 25 as a Illinois resident and Northern Illinois alum. If you would have told me that Illinois would be in the top 25 heading into this week, I would have looked at you like you were a little crazy. But kudos to the Illini, 5-1, 2-1 in the Big Ten, and playing well. Not the most exciting game in terms of DFS today, and I had to laugh because Illinois played Iowa last week, and the final score was 9-6. And Iowa had a drive where they punted, and then they recovered a muffed punt, and then they got another turnover, and then they went backwards, they punted again, they got another turnover, they went backwards again, and they kicked a field goal. And Iowa had like a negative, if you combine all those, they went for like negative 15 yards or something and ended up kicking a field goal. And Illinois won the game 9-6. I mean, that Iowa offense, it could be the worst offense from a Power 5 school that we've seen in my lifetime. They're just so bad.
Yeah, they're pretty bad. I mean, it's kind of ridiculous when you watch some of these Big Ten games. It's just nuts. And like, that's why a lot of people complain when they're on the slate, but I really don't, because there's a lot of just X out the game. Minnesota, Illinois. I mean, I'm going to have some Chase Brown just because like his touches are just unreal, but I'm still not expecting like a ceiling game there. But I mean, if he has 150 and 2 touchdowns, he's definitely going to pay off. But I mean, I kind of welcome these games because a lot of the times it's just you can X those games out and move on.
Yeah, and even in that disaster of a game last week, Chase Brown still had 31 carries for 146 yards. And he caught 4 passes as well. So the volume certainly there for Chase Brown. He is in that next range of running backs at 7,200, along with Dominic Richardson and Sean Tucker, who's probably going to be the chalk play in that range. for Syracuse, though they have a bit of a tough matchup today. And then, below them, there's a little bit of a dead zone, like the 2 Ole Miss guys. Brooks for BYU, Singleton, Jabari Small against Alabama. Just not a whole lot of guys that are super interesting. Anybody you really like in this range of kind of 6.6 to 7.5K?
Yeah, I think I agree with you. Tucker, and obviously you can see by the ownership, is going to be pretty popular here. I mean, he leads the team in targets, although there aren't that many of them. And I mean, he's going to get 20 plus touches. Last week he had 225 yards and 4 touchdowns. I think that was against Wagner. I will say that, which is a weird FCS game in the middle of the season. But I like Tucker a lot. He's same thing as Chase Brown, probably in a little bit better of a game environment. But once again, he's the only guy getting snaps. When you look at the guys like this, Blake Corum, bad matchup, but like all guys from like Blake Corum, Tucker, Brown, even Richardson, they're going to get all the work there. Richardson, I just don't think is very good, and Sanders takes away a lot of his ceiling, but I don't mind him as a pivot off of Sanders, especially if we do think Sanders is a little bit banged up. That probably means he's not going to run as much as he usually would, so I think that bumps Richardson a little bit. Evans and Judkins, that Ole Miss backfield is like you always want to attack it, but you just don't know who. Judkins got a lot of the carries against Kentucky. Last week, Evans and Judkins played 29 snaps. They each got 11 carries. So it's like you cannot get more of a timeshare than that situation. I do like them both in GPPs. And then Raheem Sanders. I mean, him being the 15th highest price running back on this slate is kind of ridiculous. And I think he's in a fantastic spot against BYU. Last week, even against Mississippi State in a terrible game script with a backup quarterback, he still even paid off. And so, I mean, you see that tag from Ben on there. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you're playing cash. I don't, just play Sanders and move on. I think, and there's not really a lot of downside. Like the only downside to Sanders here is if he gets hurt. Like I don't think from a game script perspective, we saw last week, he still got work. So Sanders is my best. It's not going to be a secret. He's going to be a great play. And I think at 6.5K, that price is just kind of ridiculous. I think he was more expensive last week. So luckily, with a little bit of a floor performance, got that price down a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, at the beginning of the year, we were kind of worried that when everybody was healthy, who's going to get all the workload there. I think those questions have been answered at this point. Sanders is the guy in that backfield. Miller at 6,200, I think will get some attention as well. But again, otherwise, the 6K is pretty much a quiet area. I suppose, we're going to talk about the Ohio side of this game against Western Michigan, but Tyler on the Western Michigan side, if you think maybe they play with a lead in the game, and I mentioned the Ohio defense is bad, maybe you take that Ohio passing game and you run it back with Tyler on the other side. I think that's viable as well. Anybody else in kind of this middle range that you want to pass along a nugget about?
Yeah, Kendre Miller is, I think you can play him with Duggan. I think he's a good pivot off of him too. I mean, if you think this game shoots out, Miller's getting a lot of the carries as well. So he projects well. He's probably going to be a little lost in the shuffle with being right behind Raheem Sanders. And so I like him for GPPs too. And like I said, I think you could build a lineup to where it's like you play Richardson and Miller instead of Sanders and Duggan. And this game still moderately scores a lot of points, but not something where like you need a Duggan and Sanders performance. So I like them both as pivots. Only other guy kind of in this range is Roman Hemby. I do like that Maryland-Indiana game a lot. And Hemby actually led them in targets last week. It's really hard to peg down what receivers to play. I don't mind playing Hemby with Baby Tua because he could get in the end zone a couple times and Baby Tua could throw him a pass. So Hemby's a good GPP play. You see that lower ownership. So he's probably the only guy else I'm interested really in this range until you kind of get down to like Devin Neal and Bangura for Ohio.
Yeah, again, another member of that Ohio offense that's a little bit underpriced. Bangura, in their last couple of games that have been competitive, they had a couple of blowout losses against good Power 5 teams that you really can't, take a lot of his workload. You got to take it with a grain of salt from those games. I mean, they lost to Penn State by 36. They lost to Iowa State by 33. But their first 2 conference games, 18 for 99 and a touchdown against Kent State, and then 16 for 90 and 3 touchdowns last week against Akron. He's 5,500. If you're not playing the Ohio passing game, Bangura probably should be in some of those lineups. I do like Devin Neal as well at 5,700. And these guys make sense as flex plays or RB2 options. They're probably the 2 cheap plays that are going to get ownership. Not a whole lot in kind of that 3K punt range. You can see a whole lot of guys projected for 2, 3, 4 points. Unless you want to take a shot on a backup or a complete split backfield like Miami. With Parrish, we've got with a pretty decent projection, but I just don't think it's mega necessary to go there. We've got some value at wide receiver. Anybody in the punt range that you are considering today?
I usually talk about it every week. I really don't like punting at running back. And if I do, it's like a surefire situation where, someone's injured and DraftKings doesn't adjust the price. So Henry Parrish, I would, he got a ton of, Knighton was back last week, and I did try to find something, but I really can't see if Knighton's just limited. They're working him back. But Parrish played a ton of snaps last week, and he had 10 targets. So once again, I'd temper your expectation for Miami because, once again, they are playing at Virginia Tech, which is a lot different than playing North Carolina. So, but if I had to play anyone below 5K, that would be where I would go. I still don't feel great about it because I think there is a good chance that he splits with 2 other backs. But that'd be the only guy I'd play here, sub 5K.
Yeah, I don't like anything else either. I think you go to receiver if you're looking for some other value at the skill positions today. So let's head there. We talk about the high end of wide receivers. It starts with Hutchinson for Iowa State, who has been basically the premier DFS wide receiver this year. His game log so far this season: 8 for 128 and 3 touchdowns, 11 for 98 and a touchdown, 9 for 93 and a touchdown. Hasn't scored since because their offense has struggled to put the ball in the end zone, but still 8 for 84. That's 16 PPR points, 13 for 101, 26 DraftKings points, 8 for 100, 21 DraftKings points. I mean, Hutchinson just continues to put up numbers even though the offense has struggled. You presume they will have to throw a bit today to hang with Texas. And at 8,300 on DraftKings, I mean, it's not an exorbitant price tag. The top 2 running backs are both priced significantly higher than that. Yet Hutchinson is, putting up similar per game outputs in terms of fantasy production. So he's the top priced wide receiver on DraftKings today. The only other receiver priced above 7,300 is Marvin Mims at 8K. Obviously, he did nothing last week because of the wild situation with the Oklahoma quarterback play and the absolute blowout loss. So I wouldn't take a whole lot of stock into the 1 catch for -2 yards for Marvin Mims, but it is maybe a bit concerning that his production has lagged for a month now. He had the huge non-conference game against Kent State, hasn't caught more than 4 passes in a game since, and yet he's still priced at 8K on DraftKings. So I think the obvious play with the top-end wide receivers is Hutchinson, and that's why our projections are what they are. And then it's a big dip in pricing to that kind of next tier of Holden, if you want to play the Alabama roulette, Tinsley, Hyatt, and then Braden Johnson. I mean, then we're already down into the 6Ks. So what do you make of this top group of wide receivers today?
Yeah, if you didn't upsell Hutchinson enough, just think about Hutchinson has 87 targets on the season. The next closest guy to him on Iowa State has 37. So he's got 50 more targets than anyone else on this team. So he is the definition of the number 1 wide receiver that you want to get. Your only question here is what's his upside? Is Texas, if they blow him out, this is a good game script for him. It's 15 points. So it's not like Iowa State's going to be out of this game. So I'm not going to say if I was playing cash that he's a must, but I mean, he's definitely someone who can bury you. And you mentioned those numbers that he had. I mean, 17 targets last week. They're going to be throwing a bunch against Texas. So I know they'll try and key on him, but I mean, still, he's a great play. Marvin Mims is just an interesting, DK refuses to price down Oklahoma no matter what. And so Marvin Mims is 8K on DraftKings. He's 7.1 on Fanduel, which is very interesting. So that's basically he would be 4.9K on DraftKings if you use that equivalent pricing. So I do like Mims. I only have Mims in Gabriel lineups in that way because I just want them part of a stack. I don't think Mims goes off without Gabriel doing that as well. So that's a group that I've used a lot this year. If you have a receiver that you want to play, but it's hey, I'm just banking on this offense doing well, you can just make a group and say, okay, I only want to play Marvin Mims in Dylan Gabriel lineups. And so That'll give you some leverage. Trayshawn Holden, same thing. Like all these guys, it sounds like Bryce Young's going to play. There's a big drop off. DraftKings doesn't always do a good price of draft these receivers, but I'd say Hutchinson, if you're paying up, is definitely your priority here.
Yeah, for sure. I think he's the top end guy that you need to look to, and probably your wide receiver one that you want to play in cash game builds today, just because there's nothing else that you need to prioritize on the high end. And then you're going to start to see some differentiation in ownership as we kind of get to this next tier of wide receivers. What do we make of Tennessee today? Let's just talk about, let me just sort by them. Obviously a tough matchup against Alabama, but Alabama's defense has been somewhat vulnerable. The spread, I think, is 7-8 points in this game. Tennessee at home. I think they've got the game day crew there. Their top receiver is still out, so some value at potentially with their wide receivers and potentially some volume as well today. So high is 6,900 on DK. Brew McCoy at 5,800. You've got a couple guys, priced in the 3 and 4K range that maybe are a little bit too risky to play today. But what do you make of the Tennessee passing game?
All right, so I'll break down this game kind of how I have it working in lineup HQ. And I really think, in lineup HQ, you can build groups to basically say, like, build exact lineups as you want. I said in my article, Hendon Hooker is elite. Alabama's defense is elite. So it's what's going to break here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to say the only way I'm playing Hendon Hooker is if a Bama piece is in that. So I'm just saying, if Bama comes in, I think this is a Nick Saban statement game. Like, hey, they barely beat Texas A&M. They struggle against Arkansas. What are they going to do here? So I'm going to put it so I only have Hooker in a Bryce Young or Jahmyr Gibbs lineup. And I only have Hyatt and McCoy in lineups that have Hooker. So there, if Alabama just shuts down this Tennessee defense, it's not like I have one, I have a Hyatt and McCoy. So I think from that standpoint, it just depends how you script the game, right? But if I'm going to script either a Bama blowout or a close game, I want my lineups to reflect that. So I don't mind, McCoy and Hyatt. I think, Bama is – it's just interesting. If you think that Tennessee comes out here, you got to play one of these guys because they're out there for all the snaps. They're getting all the targets. But I'm going to be even the field slightly underweight. But like I said, the only way I'm going to have these guys in the lineup is if Hooker's in it. And then I'm only having Hooker in a lineup if a Bama guy's in it. So that's just how I'm approaching it. And you can do it however you want, but that's just an example of how by making groups in an HQ, you can really make sure you're spitting out whatever lineups that you want. And then you're not stuck there with, oh man, I have a really good lineup, but I played Jalen Hyatt by himself in a lineup and he didn't get there. I think it's very hard for Hyatt and McCoy to really crush if Hooker doesn't do well as well.
Yeah, totally makes sense. And, you can kind of go with a little mini stack of that game in the event that the Tennessee, keeps up and you see a, 38-35 type game. And all of your lineups, if you're building 50, 60 lineups, all of them aren't dead if it's 28-3 or something like that. So I like the way that you broke that down. And if you're not into Hyatt or those Tennessee guys, the other kind of mid-range wide receivers, Crooms for Western Michigan. Again, the guys in that game on DraftKings are underpriced. Quentin Johnston for TCU feels a bit underpriced at 6,700. We can play Maryland wide receiver roulette if we want to do that again today. But who are some of your favorite kind of mid-range targets?
Yeah, last week I didn't have a lot of Braden Johnson at all, but the tilt was, and I get it, right? College football, sometimes you don't have any news reporting, and like there was no report, and Braden Johnson went through warmups, and they just didn't play. So the Discord channel was alive with tilt at the start of that game and going into it because he didn't play. But if Johnson, it says he's going to play here, I think it's a great GPP spot. I don't think he's 0% owned, but his price is bumped up. So I'll have some of him. Quentin Johnson finally paid off last week. I think he had 15 targets and had three receiving touchdowns or something. He broke the slate essentially, right? So you needed him last week. Oklahoma State, I mentioned them. They've basically been giving up whatever they want through the air to opponents. So I like him. Corey Crooms is, he's the alpha there. He's getting a ton of targets. I just mentioned Western Michigan is just very bad, on offense. So, but Ohio State is one of the worst defenses in the country. So I like Crooms as well. I don't know if he comes in close to that 15%, but we'll just kind of have to see. And then Raheem Jarrett, I think is a really good play on Maryland. He's going to get a lot of the snaps. He's getting a lot of the targets, and Indiana is another pass funnel defense that's letting people do kind of whatever they want. Other than that, this is kind of a dead zone. I'm not going to play Jadon Hazelwood this week for Arkansas, so I've been playing him every single week, so I'm just expect a 2-touchdown, 150-yard performance inbound because he is going up against Arkansas. And maybe I swap to him. I will say I don't have that much exposure to the 11 o'clock games. So I have a lot of lineup flexibility. And you saw last week, it really paid off. Obviously, you're not going to do it if there are a bunch of good games in the 11 o'clock hour. But really, the only 11 o'clock game I don't want to miss out on is Kansas and Oklahoma, and even that's a fringe one. So that's one thing. I have a lot of lineups with no one in the early game. So it lets you really adjust to whatever you want. Last week, when you had that news on Texas Tech quarterback, it really helped out. So those are really all the guys I like in this range.
Yeah, it is a little bit of a dead area, especially from, you get below Johnston and Crooms from 6,400 there through maybe 5,900. Not a whole lot of guys to target. We mentioned that DraftKings doesn't want to price down Oklahoma. They seem to not want to price up Cam Camper and the Indiana receivers. So he's kind of the next. Again, McCoy, we've already talked about. I think if you're on a little bit of Hendon Hooker and Tennessee, I think he's a fine pairing there. But you've got Camper at 5,000, Xavier Worthy. Texas has been all over the place this year, obviously, with the Ewers getting hurt in the first game. And so then, they had a quarterback swap for a few weeks. And then last week, the blowout win over Oklahoma. So not a ton of volume in terms of the passing game. I mean, Worthy did have a big game against West Virginia a couple weeks back. And it kind of remains to be seen long-term, with Ewers at quarterback, what he does. But back in week one, I mean, if we would have said he's 5,700, not like it's an ideal matchup, but that's a pretty cheap price point there. If you're on the Graham Mertz train, you've got Dyke for Wisconsin at 5,600. Again, I mentioned Camper, McCoy, maybe throw a guy like Romney. I mean, and somebody in the YouTube chat had asked, and I know you're a little high on Hall, and you don't really have to pair him with anyone, but your thoughts on kind of these mid 5K receivers, and specifically, what are you planning to do with the BYU targets in the passing game?
Yeah, I love this range, honestly. From Cam Camper, he's back. Interesting, though, Cam Camper's a good play. Emory Simmons, he did well against Nebraska with Camper out, but he also led them in targets or tied. I think him and Camper had the same amount of targets last week. So I know people are rushing to play Camper, and definitely so. Like, you could say last week's a little bit of an outlier, but I also do like Simmons, who it seems like he's got the trust of this coaching staff. He's getting a bunch of snaps, so I like him. Xavier Worthy, I mentioned him at the beginning. I don't think he's going to be low owned, but definitely on the early at 5.7K. That price tag is pretty appealing. BYU, yeah, if you just want to go and look at those receivers, because Gunnar Romney didn't practice Wednesday. I don't think he practiced on Thursday either. So you've really got Puka Nacua, Cody Epps, and Keanu Hill. So and then you might have Chase Roberts playing. If Romney does not go, I think Cody Epps becomes one of the best GPP plays on the slate, and he's going to get all the run there. So I think these BYU guys, if you get noticed that, and usually you've got it pretty soon, if Romney's not out there, like if you want to build okay, I want to pair him with Romney, he's going to play, you could build with Romney, and then if he gets ruled out, you can pivot down to all those other guys. So I'd say Nacua is probably my favorite receiver there. He's at 4.9K, but there's a bunch of guys in this range that I really like, and I don't know if I'm going to go back and chase DK for Wisconsin after he broke the slate. He was a Wisconsin wide receiver was the highest scoring person of the slate last week. So are we going to chase that again this week? Michigan State also gives it up to anybody, but I think there's some good options right here, like in this above kind of like 5.3K range.
Yeah, Wisconsin receivers leading the slate. That just never happens. But and I would say certainly don't go back there on a normal week, but unfortunately they've got about the best matchup within the Big Ten that you could have today. So we'll see where that goes. I am still not going there. But again, that's at my own risk. I think I'd rather play Reed in terms of talent on the other side of that game. And maybe run it back with Braylon Allen or something. Hope Wisconsin plays with a lead, though that's not a requirement or anything like that. And your note on the BYU guys, very important, because BYU does not, or DraftKings does not have any injury designation on Romney. and they still have Chase Roberts listed as out, despite his news saying that he's expected to play. So be careful if you're relying on those injury status bubbles within the DraftKings lineup build screens, particularly with regard to the BYU guys. They are not updated. All right, let's go ahead and move down into the lower range. And actually what I'm going to do is sort this by point per dollar, and let's see who pops. So if I sort by point per dollar, you can see our 6 highest wide receivers are all priced at $5K or less. So you got the top receiver for Ohio at $5K, he's projected as the number 3 overall fantasy scorer at the position today, Wigless. And then we've got Mallory for Miami at 3,400, Watkins for Mississippi at 39, Dyches for Maryland at 38, Rashard Smith, again, Miami at 3K minimum, and Caleb Smith for Virginia Tech at 4K. So a lot of people are going to be trying to figure out which cheap wide receivers do I play? Can I play a couple of them in cash? What are your thoughts on these guys?
Yeah, I'll just poke holes in all these guys, right? So Will Mallory, I think he's the least, pretty safe play, right? 3.5K. He's the leading target guy on this team. I think he's a good play, and you see the projection, and he's not going to be like crazy owned. So like if he's 17 to 20% owned, you can really just have 20% of them or go over the field. And like if he busts, it's not really going to kill you. If you guys play Sam Wiglets for Ohio, just to preface it, when you turn on the game, if you can find it anywhere, like this guy was a walk-on at Ohio State, and he's a slot receiver. So don't go thinking he's a red zone target and complain when he doesn't score. He does have 5 touchdowns on the year, but Wiglets, I like some of these Ohio receivers a little bit more. Like Jacoby Jones is right under him, going to come on pretty low owned, and same with Cross. Jordan Watkins probably had a ceiling game last week, but if you want to go back to him against Ole Miss, that's fine. This passing game just erupted last week. We talked about the running game. I think they get back more to the running game this week, so I'm not as high on him. Corey Dyches, won me the $6 last week, so I'm a little bit biased, but I'll go right back to him. Remember last year, Albert Okonkwo for Maryland, like Baby 2, I say it every week, he loves these tight ends. So Dyches, they continue to not, price him up. I'll just keep going back there. Rashad Smith played, I think, the most snaps of any Miami receiver last week, but once again, different format, so I think he could easily not get there. I do like Caleb Smith, though, for Virginia Tech, just because he's running that back against Miami. So all these guys are good play. I'm just trying to give you just some info just when you're deciding on who to play and go back through them. I'd say of these guys, probably Mallory is the safest one, but I definitely think like Watkins and Smith, Rashard Smith have a little bit of risk there.
Yeah, I do think Watkins is interesting in GPPs. You just never know what they're going to do in terms of their, wide receivers, but he's, projected. We got him projected basically around the same as Mingo and Heath, who are double the price. So I don't mind taking some shots on him in GPPs, but the floor is definitely pretty low. Wouldn't touch him in cash games. Anything else at receiver, any plays that you're on that maybe we did not touch on?
Yeah, we basically went through everyone. Like I said, I'm going to probably be overweight on these BYU receivers. It's just one thing that you just, at least with me, you're going to have to adjust. So like if you want to play the BYU passing game, which I think is one of the keys to the slate, make sure you're, either around a computer or can make some swaps around 230, because that's going to be a lot of info that comes in that you need to know. I think, Alabama, Bryce Young's going to play. These receivers get a little bit of a bump. It like you mentioned, it is playing roulette with these guys, but really haven't got a game in a while that we've seen like a competitive game where Bryce Young is healthy.
Yeah.
So it's going to be, who's going to get all the snaps. They're still going to rotate, but I think Holden and Burton are probably the 2 safest guys there, but you're just going to have to pay up for them. So, that's really all I'll get to. I didn't mention Jaden Reed, I think, is a great pivot off of Wiglets. I mean, you can play them together, but I mean, Reed, this is a guy that last season, early this season, he was 7,300 against Western Michigan, got hurt. He's led them in targets last couple weeks. Like, I love Reed for GPPs. And I mean, not to say you can't play him with Wiglets, but like if you want to swap, they're right there and you get them at like probably half the ownership. And I definitely think Reed's a great play.
All right, before we get out of here, as usual, a few of the late games. So the FanDuel late games that they have added on, LSU and Florida should be an interesting one. Mississippi State, Kentucky, Stanford, Notre Dame, Clemson, FSU, not the most exciting games there. But UNC Duke and USC Utah could be some interesting kind of late night hammers. We know Micah likes his late night final game hammers as well. So we could see some fireworks potentially in those 8 o'clock games. Some of the plays that you are targeting from maybe those games for those who might be playing the FanDuel slate or the night slate on DraftKings.
Yeah, I mentioned just from the early games too. Marvin Mims is a really good. I mentioned he's 7,100, so make sure like he's just too cheap here. But yeah, the late night hammer. Usually, I like late night hammers regardless of the game, or at least like I don't know, something about me. Like I always just want to have someone live to where I'm chasing from behind, and sometimes it gets the best of me. But these last two games are two of the best fantasy games of this slate. UNC and Duke. Drake May, I mentioned him, is probably the best quarterback that the casual college football fan really doesn't know about. He's just been ridiculous this year. Pair him with Josh Downs. Tavion Thomas, I mentioned him last week, play him at 0.5% owned. And I think he put up 25 points and he didn't even, play the second half because he's a little bit winded. But I like him against USC. Mario Williams is also too cheap, but I mean, I have a lot of, this is why I like playing between both sites because you can almost leverage them off the two. Like I don't have nearly as much exposure to those earlier games just because UNC Duke and USC Utah are two of the best fantasy games of the slate. So Caleb Williams, Mario Williams, Jordan Addison on USC, Utah, Tavion Thomas is just too cheap for this. I mean, he's 7.3K, I think, on the night slate. Also, Drake May, PSU is saying this. Drake May is 6.6K on the DK night slate. So he should be it's inefficient ownership if Drake May is not 100% owned on the on the DraftKings night slate. But those are two really good games. All the rest of them, LSU, Florida, Mississippi State, Kentucky. I do like Chris Rodriguez for Kentucky. His price really hasn't caught up with him that much. So I like him in that game. Notre Dame. Logan Diggs got a lot of the carries. They just pounded the ball against BYU last week. And so it's a three-way timeshare, but Logan Diggs is min-price. All these Duke guys, Duke is the BYU of this slate, even though BYU is on there. But Duke has a lot of injuries you got to watch out for. Jordan Moore is pretty safe no matter what. Jaquez Moore, if Jordan Waters and Jalen Coleman do not play, Moore is essentially a free square against UNC. And so both these Moores, along with Leonard and Pancol probably takes a little bit of a hit if Jalen Calhoun plays, but Duke is in a great spot. And like you see that ownership too. I mean, and on FanDuel, like I almost just take 2 percentage points down because usually there's not a zone. But like I love all those top 3 guys for Duke. You will have to do some adjusting depending on warmups and who's in, but they're another great leverage spot of the slate. So I really like the Duke guys here.
Yeah, particularly with that being a late game and some injury statuses, people aren't going to want to wait. Not a ton of pivots at that hour if the news comes late, but the match so good that I think you can definitely take some chances on some of those guys in those 7:30, 8 o'clock games and give you some pivots in some FanDuel lineups or of course on that late slate. Not a lot of other exciting spots. I mean, I certainly think that USC offense is explosive. They're pricey, though, but you can stack up some of those guys if you want to. No issues with Williams to Addison, of course, for some upside, but tough road matchup, and they're pricey, so it's you'd have to be a multi-entry GPP type of play to get there for me this evening. All right, with that, probably time for us to put a bow on the Saturday morning show for this week. As always, appreciate you all tuning in. Let's take a look and actually see if we got a couple questions before we get out of here. Somebody had asked about our thoughts on Spencer Sanders and whether you fade him or play him. I know Micah says probably wait today in terms of he has been a little bit banged up. So if he is nursing an injury, maybe you take an underweight stance on that today. I'm fine with them. Certainly pretty safe, but in GPPs, there's plenty of pivots at the quarterback position for sure if you want to go somewhere else. Let's see. I think most of the other questions have been answered, at least within the Discord. Anybody that's asked those. So, yeah, I think we're pretty well caught up for today. Ryan Henderson, last question here from the YouTube chat. Who would you prioritize in cash builds? I think you have to get Hutchinson in there because there's plenty of value. I mean, you have to prioritize maybe one of the Ohio skill players in cash because they're so cheap. But if you look at our ownership, Raheem Sanders, was the guy that Micah kind of mentioned. But if you start with Sanders, Raheem Sanders, and Rourke, and then, maybe one of the other kind of top end guys like a Gibbs, I think the balance build is going to make sense today because you don't have to play one of these top 3 running backs. Hutchinson is really the only wide receiver spend you need to have, and then you can kind of live in that mid-range a little bit. So the balance build today, I think, will make a lot of sense. Anything else you want to pass along, Micah, before we get out of here?
No, I mean, just in terms of cash, and once again, I'll preface it by saying I don't play a lot of cash, but I would say like Rourke at quarterback, Sanders at running back are pretty much your cash locks. I think, if people aren't playing them in cash, it's probably a pretty good leg up. Just because they project so well, they're pretty cheap and let you fit in anything else. But like I said, I just make sure, for those 2:30 slated games, it sounds like we do have to worry about Spencer Sanders. And so just be sure that if you are going to play, make sure you tune into those news. So definitely looking like another fun slate and a bunch of good games too. Penn State, Michigan probably won't be that good of a fantasy game, but I mean, those are 2 unbeatens. And then you got Bama, Tennessee, Oklahoma. So a ton of good matchups today. So I'm excited to get it going.
Should be a fun day to sit around and watch some football. And tomorrow as well, we'll be back with our usual Sunday morning slate of NFL shows for the week ahead in the NFL tomorrow. So tune back in for that. But for now, we'll call it a show. Thanks for watching as always. Thanks to Steve for producing behind the scenes for us. For Micah, I am Justin. Enjoy your weekend, everybody, and we will catch you back here next Saturday. Take care.